So, in all my years of reviewing this series, I've never actually seen a scanlator site telling people to stay away from the internet. So you know things are crazy when even the scanlators are telling people to wait. And I've mentioned this before, but sometimes for whatever reason, there are specific arcs that tend to correlate with specific moments in my life. For example, when we were in Zou, that's when I got to meet Kishimoto for the first time. That happened in New York, and it was a pretty eye-opening experience for me. Then during Hokage Island, I went to Walt Disney World for the first time, which even now I still associate the structure of Totoland with the way that Walt Disney World is structured, like it's very similar. During Reverie, I got to meet Elizabeth Olsen, which I also thought was a great experience. It was awesome. And then now with Luffy's Awakening, I went to Teotihuacan in Mexico, and I was able to see the Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Sun God. So I can't wait to see what the future holds, especially because with this chapter, it definitely feels like we've entered the final stage of this story.
We're in the endgame now.
The cover shows some of Big Mom's children about to experiment/torture the Vinsmoke siblings. The guy who looks like a pumpkin, his name is Kato. The little girl in the middle with the bunny stuffed animal is Anana, and the last time we saw her in Whole Cake, she was pretty much like asking for some knives. So it seems like she finally got what she wanted. Then the octopus mermaid, her name is Prim. And then the guy in the middle with the long hat is Charlotte Brownie. And he's always reminded me of the mayor from Nightmare Before Christmas. So the scene kind of makes it seem as if Yonji and Niji are about to be dissected. That being said, I think that the exoskeleton should be tough enough to protect them, at least to some extent. Either that or somebody shows up and saves them. The chapter starts off with the booming sound of the drums of liberation, and Luffy is confused as to how he still has energy left. He doesn't know why he can still stand. What happened to him?
You can't be alive. You'd have to be a god?
We get this rush of Conqueror's hockey from him, and he says that he's having a lot of fun. The difference between happiness and joy is that happiness depends on external factors, right? So if something good happens to you, you feel happy. But joy is internal. Joy depends only on you. You can be in the worst situation you've been in your life and still be able to smile and still be joyful. So it's kind of cool when Joy Boy says, I just lost. Like, I literally just got the crap knocked out of me, but I'm having so much fun. I'm having a blast. And he starts laughing. That's the definition of joy. Somebody knocks the crap out of you and you start laughing. Saul was being frozen to death and he started laughing. Roger was terminally ill when he got to Laugh Tale and he found out that he wasn't the one to bring up the change that he wanted to bring, that it had to be somebody else, that it wasn't him. And even then, he started laughing as well. And so just recently, I was talking about how Oda was making a point that there is such a thing as inherited will within Devil Fruit powers. And so this chapter pretty much confirms that Luffy is the inheritor of Joy Boy / Nika's will, and it goes back to Whitebeard's speech in Marineford about how this is a thing that has been passed down from generation to generation, and that ultimately somebody will show up to challenge the entire world to a fight. So that's the inherited will of Joy Boy / Nika, and so now we know that Luffy is the inheritor, and Sunisha just straight up calls Luffy Joy Boy, because in the last chapter, Sunisha actually said, Joy Boy has returned. And so this whole thing kind of goes along with what the Gorosei reveal in this chapter, which I thought to be incredibly compelling because it actually connects Luffy to Zoro a lot more. So if you remember during Zoro's fight versus King, we got a flashback where we learned that essentially the swords, especially like the top tier, high tier swords, they have a will of their own. The wand chooses the wizard just like the sword chooses the swordsman. So all of Zoro's swords have chosen him specifically because they have a will of their own. Swords also have a will of their own. And so now, thanks to this chapter, we find out that all Zoan fruits also have a will of their own. And if that's the case, then maybe these Zoan fruits, just like the swords, also have a say in picking who their user is going to be. So for example, right, maybe Yamato's Devil Fruit specifically picked Yamato because that fruit, according to Kaido, that power is the power of the guardian, the protector of Wano, since Yamato wanted to be Odin. Maybe Chopper's Devil Fruit picked Chopper specifically to make him even more different from other reindeer, because Chopper was already different anyway. Like, he would get bullied because he had a blue nose. Also, Marco is a doctor, so maybe his fruit chose him as well because of its healing properties. And then maybe the Gomu Gomu no Mi chose Luffy specifically because of his childlike personality and because he valued freedom. And that could also serve to explain why the Gomu Gomu no Mi has always been able to avoid or escape the government's grasp. Because the government is about oppression. It's about ruling people from the shadows and keeping the truth from the people. Whereas the Gomu Gomu no Mi is about freedom. So the government being against freedom actually ends up repelling the fruit away. It's pretty crazy how many things you can do with just the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Like, the only other fruit that I can think of in this story that rivals the Gomu Gomu no Mi's versatility in terms of like its uses is Law's fruit, the Opi Opi no Mi. So I feel like there's so many things that you can do with both of these fruits that they're kind of broken. I was reading a post on Worst Gen where this user was trying to find, sort of tidbits or bits and pieces of information that could serve to foreshadow the value of the Gomu Gomu no Mi. And one of the things they found is that in Romance Dawn, which is sort of like a rough draft, like one of the first rough drafts that Oda wrote before he started writing One Piece, that features Luffy and features Luffy's grandfather, which would later become Garp. In that story, Luffy's grandfather calls the Gomu Gomu no Mi a mystic fruit. And then he also says that the value of the fruit is worth 5 billion berries, which is exactly the amount of money that Law's fruit is worth as well. So again, now it makes sense why those two fruits are so valuable. You got Law's fruit, which is known as the ultimate devil fruit, and then you have Luffy's fruit, which is Joy Boy's devil fruit, like a god fruit. Now I do think that this chapter could potentially open up a can of worms, specifically when it comes to the future antagonists or the future villains of the story. Because if we look at the natural progression of any story, we find that usually, typically, tension has to rise. The stakes have to be higher as we progress. That's typically how it works. The further you go in, the more dangerous things get. And so now I'm thinking, okay, so if this is how Luffy is now, then okay, what is Akainu going to have to do to match this Nika devil fruit? What is Blackbeard going to have to do to match this Nika devil fruit? What is Emu going to have to do to challenge and match this devil fruit? Because technically speaking, once we get to the final war, Oda could be like, oh, guess what? Akainu's devil fruit was never the Magu Magu. He was never a Logia to begin with. He was also a mythical type Zoan. Akainu technically ate the devil fruit of an ancient magma god, but we changed its name to protect its identity. Because of this chapter, Oda can pull stuff like that in the future. And who's to say, like, I know there's not technically like a water Logia, but who's to say that Emu doesn't have like a mythical type Zoan that allows her or him to control the ocean, to control the sea? Because now I even feel like Dragon has a higher chance of being a mythical type Zoan as well. Because we know that mythical type Zoans come with an extra effect to their transformation. So for example, Kaido is a dragon and he can control the weather. Orochi is a snake that can't die by being decapitated. Yamato is a wolf with ice powers. Marco is a phoenix with magical flames that can heal. Katarina Devon is a Kyuubi that can transform into other people. And then Luffy is a rubber man that's actually a god. I want to show you this real quick. My sister made me aware of this. So in Punk Hazard, there's a scene where Luffy meets Momonosuke, and Luffy tells him, why don't you transform back into your human form? And then Momonosuke asks how, to which Luffy responds, I don't know. I'm not a Zoan type. We get a brief scene with Sanji waking up in the pleasure hall. And speaking of Sanji, one of the things that was recently released was the cover for volume 102, in which we see that Sanji's new technique is actually blue. And so I want to go back to when he activates it for the first time. I want to go back to his dialogue, because Sanji says that Ifrit Jamba is a combination of the color of armament that he's developed added to his exoskeleton. And so I'm bringing this up because like recently in the anime, we saw that Jinbei can use Rio, and Jinbei's Rio aura is actually blue. So now I'm wondering if like Sanji's Ifrit Jamba is actually a combination of the heat from his legs with Rio at the same time. I also think it's kind of cool that Sanji's like one of the first people that we see react to Luffy's awakening, because we know that Sanji specializes in observation haki, like he's pretty sensitive. So I like the fact that it starts off with him. That being said, like I said in the last review, I honestly would have wanted more of a clash between the people in the Life Lore versus Kaido. Like I think it would have been cool to see a little bit more of like Marco and Kid and Law versus Kaido, just to see what they would do. But no, we don't get to see them put any more work. We just get some reaction shots from them. And just like Sanji, I'm assuming that Kid, Law, Hyogoro, and Marco are using observation. Because if you notice, like Nami and Tama have to be told by Marco that Luffy is okay. It's not something that they perceived by themselves. So I'm guessing that Marco is using observation haki, and that's why he's able to tell the girls that. Because the girls don't have observation haki. Now before this chapter, we just had two mythical Zoan human fruits. The first that was introduced belonged to Sengoku, which is the the Golden Buddha model. And then the second one we saw in this arc, which was Onimaru's Onyudo model, or the Giant Monk model. Now, the way that the Gorosei describe the Sun God Nika model, or like Nika's Devil Fruit in this case, I think serves to confirm a theory that I had from the very beginning when it was first revealed that the Gomu Gomu no Mi could potentially awaken into something much greater. So this is what I said in my review for chapter 1037. So it makes a lot of sense, right? If the Gomu Gomu no Mi awakening is capable of stretching things out, other things, even animals, right? Then maybe that means that the ancient user of the Gomu Gomu no Mi awakened it, and that's why Long Ring Longland and its inhabitants look the way they do, because of Nika or Joy Boy using awakening. Tonjit, which is the old man that lives there, says that the reason that the animals grow so long is because they are able to live freely without feeling any restraint, either mentally or physically. And so that pretty much fits the description that the Gorosei have for the Nika fruit perfectly. The Gorosei says, "Awakening brings his rubbery body greater physical strength and freedom. It is said that in all the world there is no power more ridiculous." Which, I mean, ridiculous fits Long Ring Longland perfectly. This also fits what I said before about how maybe it was Joy Boy who actually stretched out Sunisha's legs, because we know they were friends in the past. A cool little reference that I noticed is that if you go to the newest anime opening, when Luffy falls into the water, before he opens up his eyes, before he awakens, you do get to see the moon in the background. So it's a nice hint to what we see in this chapter. I've talked a lot about how Oda loves doing the sun and moon dynamics and symbolism throughout the series. So just having like that shot of like Sun God Nika jumping underneath the full moon seems to drive that point home even further, because we get the sun and moon within the same panel. Now, we don't get to see Luffy use any named attacks in this chapter, but I am kind of curious, like, is he still going to be calling them like Gomu Gomu no blank? Or is he going to be adding like Nika Nika to their names? Because what I'm assuming is that all of the past attacks, their names are going to stay the same. So it's still going to be like Gomu Gomu no pistol, you know, Gomu Gomu no cannon, Gomu Gomu no Gatling, whatever. But then like when he enters Gear 5th, this is where he starts, you know, naming attacks in a new way. One of the things that I really want to see in the anime from this chapter is the way they handle Luffy's laugh. Because he's giggling from start to finish. I mean, he doesn't stop laughing at all. You read these panels throughout the chapter, and his laughter is almost contagious. Like, even by the end, he's laughing like, ahia, hia, 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 which I think it was Redon who said that this is the way that he laughs when he eats a magic mushroom in Amazon Lily. And speaking of mythical type Zoan devil fruits that choose their users, we go to Hiyori and Orochi is just straight up acting like a snake. He's trying to slither his way out of paying for the consequences of his behavior by just making up a bunch of lies. And so again, this is kind of why I wanted Usopp to be the one to defeat Orochi, because they're both liars. Except Usopp is an example of a liar who's a good person, and Orochi is an example of a horrible person that's a liar. So they're pretty much like different sides of the same coin. Then we get like a brief recap of the pain that Odin had to endure for 5 years while making a fool out of himself, dancing in the streets, and just how important his family's support was for him during that time. And again, I think it's important to remember that Odin essentially died believing in the return of Joy Boy. And so did Toki, right? And so everything kind of comes full circle there with Hiyori's speech about like, the dawn will come. So it's kind of cool how she's echoing the words and the beliefs of her parents in this chapter with Luffy's awakening. And again, just like I said in the beginning about the definition of joy, Hiyori mentions that no matter how hard the situation was for Odin, he still kept smiling. And so I think it's important to remember that at that point in the story, Odin already knew what the One Piece was because he had already gone to Laugh Tale by then. And so I think it's interesting that he tells Hiyori that no matter how hard things are, at the end of the day, he's okay because he has people to love who love him. And so it kind of reminded me again of the Romance Dawn story that Oda wrote before he started writing One Piece. Because in the story, the character of Luffy's grandfather tells him that real treasure has nothing to do with material things. It's not gold or diamonds or anything like that. And that he'll figure it out once he sets out to sea. Regardless, Kanjuro's Kazembo shows up and actually ends up burning Orochi, and that's pretty poetic for several reasons. Number one, because in Japan in the past, a Kazembo was essentially a monk that would set himself on fire to be able to reach enlightenment. But then also in chapter 1030, Orochi pretty much commands Kanjuro to use one last attack to end the Kurozumi clan. I mean, he tells him to end everything, but he also says, only you can lay our souls to rest, Kanjuro. And so from the start, the whole purpose of Kanjuro's Kazembo was to send off the Kurozumi clan in a blaze of glory. Hence why we see it attack Orochi in this chapter. It's also pretty hypocritical of Orochi to tell Hiyori that taking revenge is old news, that it's a thing of the past, when in fact the only reason why he wanted to become shogun in the first place, the reason why he sought power, was because Orochi wanted to get revenge on the people of Wano for persecuting him for being a Kurozumi. Anyway, we cut right out of there and we get the revelation that this new form is Luffy's peak. It's the pinnacle of what he can do, and we get the Gear 5th speech bubble, and then we get this giant rush of Conqueror's Haki hitting the people on the performance floor. People are foaming at the mouth, people are fainting. So that takes care of some of the fodder, and in the panel where Luffy stretches out his arm to grab Kaido like a snake, in that panel, there's actually a guy wearing a jacket or a shirt that says Tita. And so I found that that word can actually mean sun in Japanese. Another post that I saw mentioned how the way that Luffy grabs Kaido and spins him around and slams him into the ground could be a reference to what Luffy does against Oars in Thriller Bark. And then Kaido's really glad that Luffy is back because he didn't want to win that way. So he shoots a Bottle Breath at him, and Luffy actually bounces it back by turning the ground into rubber and shooting it back at him. So he's giving the ground the properties of his own body, right? Because that's how Luffy sort of bounces back bullets and stuff. So what I think is interesting is that Luffy now has like two types of awakening, right? He has the Zoan awakening, which allowed him to get back up. That's the Zoan awakening. It's like the durability. And then he also has the Paramecia awakening that starts affecting things outside of his body. So it's like he has two in one. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if later down the line, when we find out what Logia awakenings do, like I'm pretty sure that Luffy's Devil Fruit is also going to have like a way of showcasing like a Logia awakening because of the fire. It really does remind me of King, and how King essentially had like 3 Devil Fruits in one. Because King was a Zoan, first and foremost, but his body could stretch like rubber, which is the power of a Paramecia, and then he could also wield fire and lava. So that's kind of like a Logia. So it's 3 in 1, and I feel like Luffy's going to be the same thing. And speaking of 3 in 1, we know that Blackbeard already has a Logia and a Paramecia, right? So in order for him to be a threat, in order for him to actually be a challenge for Luffy after this chapter pretty much guarantees that the third Devil Fruit that Blackbeard is going to get has to be a mythical type Zoan as well. And it actually got me thinking, like, you know how Momonosuke ate like the artificial version of Kaido's mythical type Zoan Devil Fruit? So what if Vegapunk is actually able to create an artificial version of the Nika Devil Fruit? And what if Blackbeard eats that one? And that's what the final fight looks like. Blackbeard Nika versus Luffy Nika. And people are already saying that this was foreshadowed back during the Ace fight, because like before the final clash, Blackbeard says, okay, let's see who wins, the darkness or the sun. And so of course, darkness wins in this case, Blackbeard wins. But there's obviously going to be a rematch because he's going to end up fighting the sun again. Only this time it's going to be Luffy. So we finally get to see the design of Gear 5th in all its glory. It obviously has like that steam cloak or that steam cloud that goes around Luffy's shoulders, which we've seen in all of Luffy's Gear 4th forms. So it's no wonder why Hyogoro said that he looked like the fire god in Gear 4th. And then we actually get to see his full face by the end of the chapter, and I just thought to myself, man, this kid looks identical to Iñaki Godoy. So of course Iñaki is the actor that Oda picked specifically to play Luffy in the live-action Netflix series. We also get a shot of Luffy's eyebrows in this, and the direction of his eyebrows reminded me of Sanji's post-time skip eyebrow, because they spin in the same direction. Well, and then also Nika's eyebrows reminded me of the spirals in Devil Fruits. Gets me to think that maybe Nika was the one who created them, because he was having so much fun in the past. And then actually, Dragon Form Momonosuke's eyebrows also spin in the same direction as Nika's. Now obviously this Nika Gear 5th / Awakening is very cartoony, right? It just seems like it's like Toon World from Yu-Gi-Oh! But again, because part of the awakening, at least when it comes to Paramecias, is that you begin to affect things outside of your own body, I find it interesting that when Luffy grabs Kaido, Kaido's eyes bug out as well, as if he were a cartoon. So again, it's almost as if he's transferring that effect onto Kaido. He's having an effect on somebody else, on another animal, on another mythical type Zoan. So it goes along with what I said about Long Ring Longland, and how I'm pretty sure that, like, you know, the previous user did stuff to the animals, to the plants, and that's why everything looks so silly over there. Now what's also important to note is that this is just technically like the beginning of Gear 5, right? Or Gear 5th. This is just base Gear 5th. With Gear 4, we had Bound Man, we had Tank Man, and we have Snake Man. So that's like 3 forms for Gear 4th. I think there's still going to be more forms of this Gear 5th. We're going to see more. And I'm actually thinking about, since Nika, or this double fruit power, is a human fruit, or it's the Hito model. At least that's the root of it. That's basically what Chopper has. Well, Chopper isn't a mythical type Zoan, but he does have a human fruit, right? The Hito. And even though Chopper has like a standard Zoan, look at all the forms that he was able to create for himself with his pills. So if that's what Chopper can do, and he doesn't have a mythical type Zoan that belongs to a god, I can only imagine how many forms Luffy is going to have after this, right? And then maybe even Chopper comes up with a special medicine, a special pill for Luffy that gives him another form or something. Now, I also think this is a pretty good moment to remind everybody that every time Luffy uses a new gear, there's always a drawback. There's always a drawback. There's always some kind of a price to pay for a new gear. So, for example, gear second, it's like, the lifespan kind of depletes the lifespan. It kind of uses up a lot of energy, so Luffy has to eat. Gear third, it turns him into like mini Luffy. Gear fourth, he runs out of hockey. He can't fight for a while. And so now I'm thinking, okay, what's going to be the drawback for this one, for Gear fifth, Awakening? Because he does say, like, when he wakes up, like he says his heartbeat feels different, like it feels kind of funny. He says, I can do everything I wanted to do. I think I can fight for a bit longer. So it's not like this is going to last forever. So I'm guessing that he's probably going to be half dead after this. I want to show you guys something real quick, because I briefly mentioned Blackbeard and how I thought that this chapter pretty much confirms that he's going to eventually get a mythical type Zoan Devil Fruit. Unless he already has one. But so this chapter came to mind. It's chapter 19. The title of the chapter is called Devil Fruit. And so during an SBS, Oda said that if Luffy were an animal, he would be a monkey. And if Blackbeard were an animal, he would be a hippopotamus. So I want to show you this cover here. It's Luffy with a hippopotamus that has a swirl, that has a spiral on its face. And Luffy is sitting in a box that says danger. So I think if Teach ever gets a mythical type Zoan, it'll probably be like a legendary hippopotamus god. I really liked Luffy's enthusiasm by the end of the chapter, specifically when Kaido apologizes for the way that he won. And Luffy's like, nah man, don't sweat it. Because it reminded me of the Katakuri fight, and how he tells Katakuri, there's no such thing as fairness in a pirate's fight. That really hit home for me on a personal level, because one of the things that I've always struggled with is that I want things to be fair. Like I want good things to happen to good people and bad things to happen to bad people. But then again, who am I to decide who's good and who's bad? But it's something that I've always struggled with, and I've had a really difficult time letting go of or accepting that life isn't fair. So just to have this story tell you, like, yeah, it's not fair. Life isn't fair. But you get to decide, are you going to get back up, or are you going to be discouraged and defeated? I feel like that's ultimately the choice that we're all faced with at some point. Knowing that the world isn't fair, what are we going to do about that? Because I think I've decided that even though I know things aren't fair, my hope is that if I continue to walk long enough, maybe one day I can look back and say, okay, yeah, that made sense. According to the official One Piece staff account, there's supposed to be some news dropping later today, but because of the timing, I won't be able to cover that until next week's video. That's going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all of your support and for everything you do for the channel, not just for the channel, but for me, via the channel. Take care of yourselves. Don't be happy, be joyful, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.